All right, good morning everybody, and welcome to another ePrime live stream. My name is Devon Struthers. I am the training coordinator for Psychology Software Tools, and today we're going to kind of go back to some of the normal live streams. So in the past couple of weeks, our live streams have been a little different. They've been a little bit more informative, and they've been a little bit more feature-oriented or new product-oriented. They haven't necessarily been, hey, let's build a task together. Today we're going back to that. Today we have a task that I'm actually pretty excited about, and it's the BART, or Balloon Analogue Risk Task. I'm actually excited for it just because it's kind of fun to do. And it does demonstrate a couple of the really cool new features of ePrime 3, some of the button features. If you had missed my video about the buttons and how buttons work in ePrime, I definitely recommend checking that one out. But it does utilize some of the new button features in ePrime and shows you how if you're not necessarily, familiar with scripting, how those buttons are really going to help you out. And it does do a good job of showing you some pretty basic inline script and how that's going to work. So it's going to be a fun one today, so stick around. So let's go ahead and jump right into making the task. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to make kind of what I like to call the shell of the task. And we're going to do that by opening up the session proc here. And I'm going to drag 3 objects onto my session proc. This is one way to approach experiment design, is doing it kind of level by level, building the session proc, then the block proc, and then the trial proc for all of the tasks. Another way to do it would be more sequential. So you make the introduction, then you make the block list, and then you kind of go from there. I personally like working top down because, I built this experiment before, I know the way it works, and it just makes more sense for me to finish out the entirety of the session proc before moving on to the block proc, before moving on to the trial proc. But, as long as you have a way of making experiments that works for you, definitely use that one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a text display and I'm going to drag it and drop it as the first object in my session proc here. This is going to be my welcome screen. So go ahead and rename this one to welcome. Oops. There we go. And I just renamed it by right-clicking and clicking on rename. And I'm going to go ahead and double-click on it to open it up in the workspace there. Now I'm just going to write a very simple message, just kind of explaining the task to everybody, or explaining tasks to participants, just to make sure that, hey, we all know what task we're doing, we all know what's going on here. So just welcome to the task. In this task, you will be asked to inflate a balloon with the right arrow key. You can use the up arrow key or the down arrow key, whichever is more intuitive for you. I just like using the right arrow key. I think it makes most sense for me. But again, you can really use anything. I'm just going to say right arrow key for now. Watch out though. If you overinflate the balloon, it will pop and you will not receive any points. You will receive 5 points. Whoops, it looks like there we go. So my numlock key wasn't on there. 5 points for each time you inflate the balloon without popping it. If you pop the balloon, you will receive no points. Press space to practice this. There we go. So just very simple instructions on how the task is going to go. And what I'm going to do now that I've written all of the instructions for the task is I'm just going to go ahead and change some of the properties of that welcome screen. So we'll go into the properties page here, and if you've been following along with these live streams, you know that mostly we don't deal with a lot of these tabs here. Frame we might be dealing with a little later, but mostly on the slide object. Font, I kind of like Consolus. I think it's a nice looking font, so I'm going to keep all the font kind of the same way. Keep in mind that you can change it either here or using that property find and replace that I had spoken about in the past live stream. So definitely check those out if you want. But otherwise, just go to this duration input tab. This is where most of the editing is going to happen for today's live stream anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and change the duration on this one to infinite, and I do that because I like participants to have as much time as possible to read the instructions here, and I don't necessarily like, I don't like it when it moves on without the participant exactly knowing what they're going to be doing here. I'm going to change my data logging here to time audit only. I'm going to add a keyboard input mask and change my allowable from any to space. ahead and hit apply, and then hit OK. And there we go. Very simple welcome screen. So I'm going to go ahead and go back into my session proc here. And like I said, I'm going to be kind of making what I call the bones of this one, or just everything on the session proc. So I'm going to take my list object and drag it and drop it here on my procedural timeline. And I'm going to rename this one just to block list. This is, and I'm naming it block list because it is the list object that'll be controlling the different blocks in my experiment. And in this experiment, we're going to have 2 blocks. The first block that we have is going to be the practice block, so participants can practice the task. And then we're going to have the critical block, so participants are actually doing this task for real now. And then just after my block list, I'm going to put my goodbye text display object. This is why I keep saying, oh, I'm making the bones, because I have my welcome, my block list, and my goodbye, but I don't actually have a task yet. And some people don't like to edit the goodbye object until it's the very last object they edit, but I mean, like I said, I'm working from session, block, and trial, so I'm going to edit this one right now. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on goodbye and just make a very quick goodbye message. So just thank you very much for your participation. Go. And then just edit the properties one more time. This one doesn't necessarily need to stay on indefinitely. As long as participants see this, it's completely fine. So I am going to change the duration of this one. We'll just say to 3 seconds. And keep my data logging here onto time audit only. And we'll change pre-release to 0 since it is the last object in the procedural timeline. And I'll click apply and OK. And there we go. So now my session block, or session proc, is all made, or it's all created, so I don't really need to do anything else there. So the next thing that I want to do, once I've done this, is I want to go ahead and I want to edit my block list then. I want to actually add some values to this in order to actually make the different blocks of my experiment. So I'd mentioned there was a practice one and there was a practice one and a critical one, so I'm going to go ahead and make those in my block list here. So go ahead and double click on it to open it in the workspace, and this is going to look very barren. So the changes that we're going to make here are going to be very minimal, but that's actually intended. So for the procedure, the first one that we want is our practice blocks. So we're going to go ahead and type prac block proc and hit enter. Now I'm going to get my favorite messages that prac block proc doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? I'm going to hit yes. And then would you like to make the default value for newly created levels? I'm going to click no because I want a new level with a different procedure on it. I'm going to go ahead and click no. And then all I need to do to add a new procedure or a new block of procedures is to click on add level. And then my procedure in this case is just going to be block proc. And then doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? Of course I would. There you go. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on my block list here. And just take a look at some of its properties. Right now it is set to sequential selection, so that means E prime is going to go through my prac block proc and then go through my block proc in that order exactly. And it's going to go through sequential selection, and it's only going to run through these one time. We're going to go ahead and edit some of those properties later on other list objects, but for now let's keep to this one. Go ahead and close all my windows here just because I like to keep everything kind of nice and orderly. And then I'm going to go ahead and double click on that prac block proc so I can start editing some of the properties here. Now the first thing I want to add in this prac block proc is I want to make an inline object. Now what the purpose of this inline object here is actually going to be just to determine how many pumps or how often or how many times I can inflate the balloon before it pops. And this is actually going to be using a pretty cool function. It's called the random function in E prime. And you basically feed E prime this random function, and it will randomly select a number from your starting number to your ending number. And it will, obviously do this every time you call the random function. We'll call a random number, and then it'll allow you to, randomize per participant how many inflations of the balloon they get. So I actually have this script written down somewhere else, which is what I was pulling up, just to make sure. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag and drop an inline object here. And I'm going to rename this inline object just to end number. Now it's pretty easy to keep the inline object names just to inline 1, inline 2, inline 3, those types of things. But I do recommend actually changing it to match the function of the script that's inside of it. That way whenever someone's editing your experiment, they look at it and they go, oh, that's where the end number is being set. Or something like that. Just so, if anyone else happens to get your task, they know, oh, okay, this is what this is doing. Now, in order to determine how many pumps, or in order to determine this random number, what I need to first do is I need to define a variable in E prime. Now, my variable is just defined with a dim statement. So I will say dim, just call this one random number, and I'm going to define it as a long. Now keep in mind there's a lot of possibilities for what I can define this as, especially if I'm just looking for a number. I could call it a long, I could call it an integer, I could call it a double, those types of things. I'm doing long in this case as opposed to integer because way back in the day when computers were newer things and they didn't have as much memory as they do now, it was important to differentiate between whether you're using a long or an integer, specifically because longs can hold, the long data type can hold more information and more numbers than an integer can. And way back when that was really important because longs would take up much more computer processing power than integers were. So if you're only doing a small number, let's say between 1 and 100 like we are, it was important to make sure that you were using an integer. However, since this is the future, I mean, I'm using a laptop right now. I think it has 8 gigs of RAM on it. I mean, you know, we don't necessarily need to make that same type of differentiation because the difference between a long and an integer definitely isn't going to hold up my computer right now. So I'm just going to use long, and generally speaking, it is what we recommend at PST, that if you have the choice between a long and an integer, we recommend just using a long. It just mitigates a lot of the possible risk with using an integer and possibly getting that overflow or overflowing that variable. So now that I have my variable defined, I want to actually set it to a random number between 1 and 100. So to do that, what I would do is I would say random number equals, and now this is that random method that I had talked about. So I would say random, and then in parentheses here, I would do my starting number, and then a comma, and then my ending number. So I would like the possibility on the lowest end of the spectrum for there only to be allowed 1 pump of the balloon or 1 inflation of the balloon. And then at its maximum, I would like 100. Oops. So now E prime is going to randomly generate a number from 1 to 100, and that is going to be the number of pumps or the number of inflations that we can do on the balloon. So now that I have that random number, I'm going to keep that for now. And I'm not going to really edit too much more about this yet, because what I want to do next is I want to go ahead and make my trial list for this, I want to make a trial list for this object. So I'm going to go ahead and keep my end number right there, and after end number, I'm going to take a list object and drag it and drop it. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this one just to prac trial proc, and hit enter here. We go ahead and double click on it to open it in eStudio Structure window. And now what I want to do is I want to make a new trial, obviously. So the new trial in this case is going to be called trial proc. Now there's a reason why I'm not calling this prac trial proc. Whoops, I want to rename this list actually. It does exist, I would like to create it, and I would like to make the default value. So I want to actually call this list prac trial list, just because that object isn't necessarily a procedure, it is a list object. There we go. Just to kind of differentiate between the actual name of the list object and the name of the procedure object itself. All right, so in my prac trial list, I want to actually make three different attributes. I want to make an attribute for the first part of the balloon name, an attribute for the second part of the balloon name, and an attribute that lets me know what my starting or what my ending number was. So the attribute that spits out what is here. And that's why I kind of waited to fill in the rest of that script, because I am going to want this to populate a row of my list object. And I'm going to show you exactly how to do that in inline script, and it's kind of a cool method as well. So the reason I'm breaking up my file names into two parts is I actually want to show you my files, because it's going to make more sense. So I have all of my files here in this folder called BART Livestream, and then all of my images are in this folder called BART Images. Now if you can see here, just a bunch of balloons. I'm not necessarily going to be using this balloon 1 image, but I am going to be using blue 1, blue 2, blue 3, blue 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and if you look, I go all the way up to 100. And then I have explosions at each one of those increments. Now, what I could do is I could have a list object that contains all of these names, and that's going to be really long and really boring for me to show you guys, because it's just going to be me going next attribute type, next attribute type. There is a way to make this much easier. If you notice, all of these balloons here have the first 5 letters in common, blue and then the underscore. So those are all going to be common regardless of the image that we're using. From blue 1 to blue 100, that blue and that underscore are exactly identical. What's going to change is that number afterwards. And if I take that and put it in a separate attribute, what it's going to allow me to do is I can keep that first one, or that first part, that blue underscore, I can keep that static no matter what I'm changing, and just increment that last variable over and over. So just go blue 1, blue 2, blue 3, blue 4, blue 5. And what it's going to show, and I'm not entirely sure if you can see that very well just by looking at these images, but my balloon is going to gradually inflate. And if you can see, it's getting a little bigger. So it's going to give the impression that whenever they push the right arrow, the balloon is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then if you can see here, down here, I have the balloon exploding at the exact same size that matches the balloon up here. So then the explosion is going to have to match whatever that is. So that's why I'm breaking that into two attributes. My first part is going to be just a reference to those BART images, and then the word blue with that underscore, and then the rest of it is going to be 001, 002, 003, things like that. So let's go ahead and hop back into here. And I'm actually going to save this quick just so I can reference those files. So I'm going to save this on the desktop here in this BART live stream folder. And I am just going to call this one BART live stream. There we go. So went ahead and save that. So now what I need to do is I need to actually make those two variables that those two attributes that I was talking about. So go ahead and click Add Attribute, and I'm just going to call this one Balloon Name, because this is going to be that first part of the balloon name that I was talking about. And what this is just going to be, this is going to be BART Images, because that's the name of the folder that we have here, BART Images. And then if you're referencing a subfolder in ePrime, you need to do BART Images, and then, or the name of the folder, it's not always BART Images, obviously, and then do a /, and then you're going to want the name of the file that you're referencing. So in this case, it'll be blue, and then underscore. Now keep in mind, that's where I'm going to stop with this balloon name, because what I'm going to do is that BART and then that blue and that underscore, and then I'm going to have another attribute that's going to tell me exactly what I'm going to be, exactly what that number is in this case. So what is that increment variable? So I'm actually just going to call this one, in this case, increment. And I'm just going to set it to the very first one, because the first balloon that we're shown should obviously be 001. So I'm going to do that. So I have my balloon name underscore 001, and then I'll add that .bmp on later. That won't be a problem. Then I'm going to go ahead and add one more attribute, and this one is just going to be called end number. Now this is why I wanted to wait to do this list object before finishing out that end number. Inline object that I had, is because right now it's set to a question mark, but keep in mind that every time we run this experiment, it's going to change because of that random function in there. So now what I need to do is I need to take the value of this random number variable that I just made, and I need to put it into my list object right there. And so instead of the question mark, it actually holds the value of this random number that I have. And that's pretty easy to do in ePrime, and I'll show you how to do that. So now that I have that already set, and I have my random number defined, and my random number is now set to a random number between 1 and 100, or 2 and 2000, whatever you prefer, I need to actually set it to that cell on my list object. Now to do that, what I would do is I would first reference the list object by name. So I will say prac trial list dot. So now I know that I'm in or working in the bounds of my prac trial list. And then I will say set attrib, which is the way to set a specific attribute in ePrime. And if you're doing the list object dot set attrib as opposed to the c.set attrib statement, you also have to tell ePrime what row of the list object you want to alter. Now for us, that's really easy, because if you go into prac trial list, there's really only one row. So I don't need to sit there and think, okay, well, this trial will be this one, this will be this one. There's only one row that I'm incrementing. So all I have to do then is I have to go back into here for set attrib and press 1 and then comma. So now I'm telling ePrime in my prac trial list I want to edit the value of an attribute on row 1. And now I have to feed it the name of the attribute. So in this case it's going to be that end number attribute that I had made earlier. So now I'm telling ePrime, hey, on row 1 I want to input something in the cell for end number, and that's going to be random number. So this is how in E prime you would get a variable into a specific cell in a list object. And then I need to do one more quick thing in order to make this work. And it's kind of like clicking the apply button whenever you're making edits to list objects like this. And all I would do is just prac trial list dot reset. And what that's going to do is it's going to take all of the changes that I made, or all of the change, I only made one, to the list object, and then it will essentially apply it to the list object. So now whenever it runs, it's not going to show up as question mark, it's actually going to show up as this random number that I had placed in there now. So that's going to be one of the better parts of this. All right, so now that I made that edit, I think I'm done now with this end number and with this prac trial list. I only need one. They're only going to run through practice one time. And yeah, so now what I need to do is I need to go ahead and I need to change this trial proc. I want to actually start adding some elements to my objects, because right now the only visual part of my experiment is that welcome screen, and then there's no real experiment. Everything kind of happens behind the scenes. So the first thing I want is a fixation object, just to kind of center the participant's attention to the middle of the screen. So I'm going to rename this one just to fixation. And my fixation object is just going to be a plus sign in the center of the screen here. And then I will change my duration input. This one only really has to be 500 milliseconds. It doesn't have to be long. And keep my data logging to time audit only. Going to go ahead and click OK to accept that. And then the next thing is going to be me actually showing the balloon. So I'm going to go ahead and add on my trial proc here. I'm going to add another slide object. And this one is just going to be called Balloon Task. There we go. I'll go ahead and double click on it to open it. Now, here's where it's going to get a little different. But I actually want to show off one of the cooler new features of ePrime. Now, obviously, we have images that we're displaying here to participants. Instead of displaying images, though, instead of actually having these as images, what I'm actually going to do for my balloon task is I'm going to make this a button instead of an image, and I'm going to put my image on the button itself. Now, I know that that sounds a little different, and if you're used to ePrime 2, that doesn't seem like what you should do at all. But once I add the inline script for this, it's all going to make a lot of sense. So what I'm going to do is take this button object and add it to the center of the screen. And right now I need to change a lot about it. It says button, it's gray, this doesn't look like a balloon at all or even an image. So let's go ahead and change some of the components of this. So if I click on this properties page, in this slide object properties page here, the first one I want to do is I want to go to frame, and I want to make this a very consistent frame because we're going to need to put something else in its same place later. So I'm going to change the height and width of this to 50 and 50. That way I know that it is going to be taking up 50% of the screen, and then I'm going to be changing the X and Y position here to center and center. Just very easy numbers to remember, and like I said, that's totally going to come into play later. Now's where I actually change a lot of the stuff about this. So first I want to change the text on it. I don't want it to say button, I want it to say nothing. So I'm going to go ahead and click apply. And now that text is gone, which is great. And I also want to change this background. I don't want it to look like a button, I want it to look like a balloon. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight all of this in the file here and just go ahead and delete all of it. However, now it's just nothing. It's no part of the screen, you can't see anything, just a big white square. Let's actually add that image. So for image, what I'm going to add is balloon name, that attribute that I had made, which fills it in with that BART images and then that underscore, and then I'm going to make another attribute to that increment variable, and then put my .bmp afterwards, because if you notice, all of these image files, and I have to go into properties to find this, I don't have the details, all of these image files are BMP files. So .bmp is the file extension for every single one of these. And it's also kind of important to maintain that consistency because it just makes it easier to reference like this. But what referencing the image like this is going to do is it's going to take the first part called balloon name and it's going to concatenate it with increment. So it's going to say balloon or blue underscore 001 or whatever the increment happens to be at that point, and then it'll do .bmp at the end, so it'll have a full file name there. I'm going to go ahead and click apply and OK. So now that's really all I need to change about the visual part of this, but I do need to do some interesting things in the background of this. So let's go ahead and click on the properties page, and I'm going to go ahead and walk through some of the explanations that I have for changing these properties, because they might seem a little weird at first, especially if you're not used to doing this kind of task. So I'm going to go ahead and go into this duration input tab, and I'm first going to change the duration from 1,000 to 0. Now, I know what you're thinking. This won't actually leave the screen right away. What we're instead going to do is we're going to handle all of this with a do loop. So we're going to have a nice long bit of inline script just after it. That's going to have, a lot of script in it, and I'm going to walk you guys through it line by line. Instead of typing it all out, I'll walk you through it. But it's going to be handling all of the timing on this object. But I do want the data logging here to be set to standard, and I want my pre-release to be set to 0, because you can't have pre-release greater than the duration, and 0 just makes sense. So I'm going to click apply to save those changes, and then I want to add an input mask, because if you remember, I want the right and the left arrow keys to be what is used to inflate the balloon. So go ahead and click add, and then I'm going to add a keyboard input mask there. And then for my allowable, instead of any, I want to reference the right and left arrow keys on the keyboard. So I will do right arrow in those curly brackets, and then left arrow in those curly brackets. And that's just how you would reference the right and left arrow keys in ePrime. If you have any questions about, oh, I want this special key or I want this special key, we have a really great article about it in the command reference. If you go to help and then click on ePrime command reference, we have a really great article in there. So I definitely recommend checking that one out. As far as correct is concerned, we don't need anything to be correct. Both are technically correct. And then as far as time limit's concerned, we don't want it same as duration. And this is one of the things that's really easy to kind of confuse in ePrime, is the difference here between time limit and duration. Now, duration is how long is this object on the screen. Time limit is related to the input mask, so it is how long do I have to respond to this object on the screen. If I keep it as same as duration, participants are going to have 0 milliseconds to push the right and left arrow key, and that's not what I want at all. So I'm going to go ahead and click on advance here. Actually, before I do that, I'm actually going to change my time limit here just to end of proc. So now the time limit is going to let people respond to this keyboard input mask all the way until the procedure's over, which is going to be a really long amount of time, which is exactly what we want. So now I'm going to go ahead and click on advance, and I'm going to change the max count as well, because I can have participants pressing the right or left arrow keys up to 100 times. So I want to go ahead and change this just to, let's say, 105 in this case. So participants can respond using the arrow keys up to 105 times, which is honestly way more than they ever need to. And then as far as termination responses, we're going to keep that completely blank and just hit apply and OK. So now that's all of the changes that we need to do to this slide object in order to make it function correctly with the inline script that we're going to use next. So go ahead and click apply and OK to save these changes. And then I'm going to make an inline object just after my balloon task. And again, the name should follow the function, so this one is just going to be called process responses. There we go. Because it'll be processing the responses from the balloon task. So what I'm going to do is, like I said, I'm just going to copy and paste this script for you guys, because it's kind of long in order for me to type all of it out, but I'm going to walk you through it line by line. So this is a script that I had come up with a little earlier, and it's pretty easy script, honestly. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and a lot of it's actually taken from a sample that we already have on our support site called process responses. And what that does is it actually actively updates the screen based on responses that participants make to the keyboard, which is exactly what we're doing here. It's going to actively update the screen and actively inflate the balloon based on how we press a button on the keyboard. So let's walk through the script quick. So the first thing I have here is just a dim statement for something called the response object. I'm defining it as an RTE runnable input object, which basically means that later I'm going to want to reference the balloon task as a slide, because I'll be making changes to the slide object itself. I'm going to make a counter variable, which is going to determine how big the balloon is. And right now balloon size is 1, because it's going to be referencing this blue 001 image, and I'm going to be incrementing that over and over again. And that'll come into play. All of these variables are going to come into play later. I have a Boolean variable set. Boolean, for those of you who aren't familiar, is just, it's kind of like a yes and no, like a light switch, on and off, yes and no. Just letting me know, should I end the task now? And I'm setting that to false because it's the very beginning of the task. Of course, we shouldn't end it right away. I also have the response count as a long. It's going to keep track of how many responses are made to this balloon task object, and the response data, which is going to track what I'm actually pressing on the keyboard. Now the first one I have here, or the next line here, is a slide. So I'm going to be referencing something called the slide because I'm going to be actively updating it. And the slide is called balloon task, and then I'm referencing a specific slide state, which is this right here, which means this is my entire slide state, and this state is called state 1. So that's how I'm referencing that, is set the state equal to the slide, which is balloon task.states.item and states 1. And then finally, I'm making one more variable here called the slide button. And this is how I'm going to actually be updating the image that's on that slide button, is I have to gain access to the slide button, and it's just the slide.objects and button 1, because that's how I'll be referencing that. Now here's where all of the actual timing of my task comes in. I had mentioned that I'm not actually going to be handling any of the timing on the balloon task, and if you were paying attention or following along, the duration of the balloon task is actually set to 0. And I said that it'll all be handled in this do loop. So what this do loop is, it starts here on line 38 and it ends down here on line 85. So that means E prime is going to sit between lines 38 and lines 85 in this inline script and just do them over and over and over and over until whatever condition I set is met. And the condition that I set here is that the balloon size, which is that variable that I have that keeps track of how big the balloon is greater than that end number that I set up there, or this bool end task variable I set. So this boolean that says you should end the task is set to true. So I have two possible conditions, and only two conditions, that will get me out of this loop and we'll move on from balloon task. The first one is that the balloon size is greater than that end number, which means we've popped the balloon, or that bool end task variable is set to true, which means the participants pressed the left arrow key and opted out of inflating the balloon any further. So to get into this do loop and to show you what E prime is going to do while it sits here, is first we have an if-then statement. It begins on line 43 and it ends on line 83 here, right here. So what this does is it says, I don't want E prime to do anything below here until I've guaranteed that I've made a response, or that a response has been made to this balloon task object. And that totally makes sense, because if you look down here, E prime is doing a lot of very response contingent things that I'll explain in a second. And E prime can't do any of these until an actual response is made. So I have this if-then statement that says if n response count doesn't equal the response object dot input mass dot responses dot count. So I have this little counter variable called n response count, and if they don't match the number of responses that have been made, that means participant made a response, and then we incremented one further. So this is just an if then statement saying, hey, checking for a response. And then right now I am doing this. So after I increment that response count, what I have is this this line of script here that sets the response data to the response that was just made. So I'm actually saying, hey, this is this is the response that I just made. And then I have these two setAttrib statements here. And what these do is they're actually going to log the response and the reaction time of each and every pump of my balloon. So the data file is actually going to show how many times a participant pressed the key and how long it took them to press that key. So if you ever want something like a decision time, you're going to want to look at the response data.rt in your data file. So now that I'm logging both or all of the responses, I don't really care what I'm doing at this point. All I know is that, hey, the participant made a response, and hey, I want to log that response in my data file because I want that data for later. Now we have to actually process the data and process the responses that have been made. So that's where this if-then statement happens here. So the first one is if the response data.resp is right arrow, then. So I'm saying this is what happens when the participant presses the right arrow on the keyboard. Balloon size equals balloon size plus 1, so I'm going to increment that balloon size one more time. I have a debug.print statement, which I can go ahead and get rid of there. All that debug.print statement was doing, if you look here, it just says balloon size for real this time, is just saying, hey, this is what my balloon size is right now. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that because I don't necessarily need debug scripting right now. And then I have this if balloon size is less than 10. Now I have this little if then statement here because it's really important to keep those zeros in place for our image files. Because if you notice here, all of the single digits here are balloon 001. But once again, the double digits, there's only a single zero. So balloon 10 or 010, balloon 011, balloon 012. So what I'm doing then is if the balloon size is less than 10, then I'm setting this increment variable here to 0, 0, and then the balloon size. So if I press the right arrow once, what it's going to do is it's going to set that increment attribute that I have, which is in my prac trial list right here. It's going to be filling that in instead of having it as 0, 0, 1. It's going to put 0, 0 and then whatever the balloon size is. However, if the balloon size is greater than or equal to 10, remember I only need that single 0 in the beginning and not the 2 leading zeros. So I'm going to have that increment and a 0 and then the balloon size afterwards. So this is just updating that increment attribute that I had made, and this is why I separated the balloon name from the increment attribute here, because now all I have to do, instead of trying to edit the entirety of the file name every time this happens, all I really need to do is just change that one little part there, that increment part. That's all that really needs to be updated. And then, and then I just close out of that if-then statement. So now I have just this total points variable, which I set. If you look up here in user script, I need to set that quick. So what the total points variable is going to be doing is it's actually going to be keeping track of all of the points that the users are getting for each pump of the balloon. So every time they push the right arrow key, they're going to be getting 5 points. Now I'm going to actually, if you see here, I'm referencing it just because I copied and pasted it, but I need to actually define it. Now I'm going to be defining it not in this inline object, but instead in user script. And the reason I'll be setting this in user script is because these total points are going to apply to both the practice trials and to the critical trials as well. The points aren't going to carry over between practice and critical trials, and I'll show you how to do that. But I do like them, I would like the participant to know how many points they're going to be getting. So I'm going to just have a very quick dim statement in the user script here. So dim total points as long. And that's all I need to do. So I'm just defining a variable called total points, and I'm calling it a long. And I can jump back into my process responses and everything will make sense. So I have this total points equals total points plus 5, which means if the participant presses that right arrow key, they're going to get 5 more points. And then I have this line of script here, and this line of script here specifically is why I'm using the button object and not a slide image object in order to show my balloon. And that is the slide button.theme.normal.image file name and then that image that I want to show to participants. Now the reason that I'm doing this instead of the image is because with the slide buttons, until that input mask or until that slide button is terminated and completely goes away from the screen, I don't need to continuously draw. That slide button object actually just continually increments itself and continually checks for updates just by being there. So this is going to be the easiest way for me to show a change in something, or a change in a button object, because I don't have to constantly be calling the .draw command. I don't have to be constantly updating the image file name beyond just setting it right here like you would have had to with a button object, or not button, with a slide image sub object. So this button object, it actually works a little more dynamically and actually saves you some user script as well. And I'll walk you through the structure of this very quickly because this is a newer construct here, this button object. So the first thing I'm referencing here is that slide button, which I told you I defined up here, which is just button 1. And if I go to my balloon task and click on that, it does say button 1, so that's exactly what I need. I'm referencing button1.theme. So I'm specifically accessing one of the themes of the button 1 object, and in this case I'm accessing its normal state. Because if you notice, we're not actually clicking on this balloon. We're not going to click on it with a mouse. We're not going to hover over top of it. This is an entirely keyboard-centric task. So we'll be editing the normal theme. And if you need any more explanation about how themes work with these button objects, I totally recommend checking out the ePrime New Features webinar or live stream that I did. I go into a lot of detail with those themes, so if you have any questions about that, definitely check those out. But under the normal theme of the button, I'll be specifically editing the property called image file name, and I'm setting it to balloon name, which is that blue underscore, and then the increment variable or attribute that I had just changed up here, and I'm adding .bmp to the end because you need to kind of tack that one on. So that's all I would need to do in order to change that balloon name, or that balloon file name, is just this. And that's all that happens. So everything from this if-then statement, so line 61 here to line 72, is everything that's going to happen if the participant presses the right arrow key, which is a lot. Now I need an else if statement, which is saying, okay, they can press the right arrow key, but there's also one other choice they can make, and that is the left arrow key. And if the participant presses the left arrow key, so the response data.resp equals left arrow, then bool end task is true. And I told you that's that Boolean variable that I had set earlier that kind of acts as like the light switch, the yes or no. So did they opt to end the task by pushing the left arrow key? In this case, I'm going to set it to yes. And then if I set that to yes, I just have my end if statement there. If I set that to yes, it's going to say, okay, this statement is true because bool end task is true. I'm going to get out of this loop and end this. So now that I've done my loop, I need to clean up a few things afterwards and set some of my important variables. Now, I'm actually kind of working a little ahead of myself again here, but I'll work you through this. So first, if balloon end task equals true. So balloon end task is only going to equal true if the balloon didn't pop yet and the participant pressed the left arrow key in order to move on. This means that they actually get to keep their points. They haven't completely, they didn't pop the balloon and lose their points. They get to keep it. So I'm going to set an attribute here called points earned, and that's going to be equal to the total points, which actually gets incremented up here every time they push the right arrow key. So I'm now going to actually make an attribute so I can save it in my data file how many points they've received. And I'm changing the active state of a feedback object that I haven't created yet, which is going to be the next thing I create right now. And that feedback object is going to have an active state on it called reward state. Now, if the bool end task doesn't equal true, then what's going to happen, or what that means, is that participants popped the balloon. They didn't end up clicking left in enough time, or they got greedy and pushed right too much, or something like that. So now we need to actually set a new variable. Now, I'm setting an attribute here called exploded balloon. And this is going to be the image that they get when the balloon exploded. And if you look here in my little images, I have all of these exploded balloons. So I need to actually reference that file. Now what I'm going to do is the exploded balloon is going to be equal to the balloon name, because that doesn't change. That balloon name here, if you look at my images, doesn't actually change. It's blue underscore, and these start with blue underscore. So that is going to be exactly the same no matter what. And then I'm adding this exp underscore because that's the exploded part of the file name. So blue underscore exp underscore. And then I'm getting that increment attribute that I have again and set up there. So now it's going to explode at the exact same increment that it was when it should have exploded. And then add that .bmp at the end. So that's going to make that file name for me. And then I'm setting the active state of a feedback object that I haven't made yet to explode state. And we'll be making those next. Now what I'm also doing is I'm releasing references. So I have these variables that I defined up there, and now I'm going to be setting them, I'm going to be resetting them basically, just so they don't impact anything with the next time I call up this script. So I'm setting the value of the state, I'm setting it to nothing. I'm setting my response object to nothing. And the most important one here is I'm setting that bool end task to false. Now, had I kept that at true and didn't reset that to false, the next time I ran this task, ePrime's going to go, yeah, they clicked left on the arrow key earlier, so we're done now. And it'll just run through that really quick without them actually having to make a response. So that's important to set there. And the other thing I'm doing here is I'm doing that c.setAttrib ISI duration. So it's just I'm setting a new attribute called interstimulus interval duration, and I'm using that random method again to make a to set this to a random number between 500 and 5,000. So my interstimulus interval between these balloon responses is going to be random every time, and a random number between 500 and 5,000. And then finally, I'm doing balloon task.inputMask.timeout. Now, I'm doing that specifically because I need to get that button off the screen. If I don't call that button that I have here, nothing's telling it to go away. So it's just going to stay on the screen throughout the rest of the task. So I'm just calling a timeout here to get that balloon off the screen because I want to show the feedback and I want to show my ISI, which is just going to be a blank white screen. All right, so let's go ahead and close out all these windows, and let's go ahead and make that feedback object that I referenced so much in script there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take another slide object, and I'm going to put it just after process responses. Now, in some of our earlier live streams, we had made a really big deal out of doing something like this. We were like, we're making a custom feedback object, and we totally are. We could do a feedback display and set things to right and wrong, but I actually like working with these custom feedback objects, and all they are just slide objects with different slide states. So I'm going to rename this slide1 object to feedback. And I'm going to hit enter here. Now, since I had done the script for this, a lot of the work's already done for me. I don't have to guess too much about how this slide object needs to be formatted. The first thing that I want to change, and probably the most important thing I want to change, is I want to change the slide states on it. And I double-clicked on this process responses just as a reference. And if you look here, my feedback object has two states, one called reward state and one called explode state. So let's go ahead and work on reward state first. So in our feedback object, I'm going to change the name of this slide state to reward state. Go. And this is the slide that they're going to see when participants respond to, with the left arrow key in the slide that they see where they get their points. So I'm just going to make a very simple just little message here. So I'm just going to go ahead and take my text display object, stretch it to most of the width of the screen, and I'll say, great job, you received, and I'm going to leave this blank for now, points. Now, in order to get how many points they have, if I look in my process responses inline object again, you'll see that I'm making this attribute called c.setAttrib points earned. So points earned is what I need to reference if I want my total points. So in my feedback object, I will move my cursor there, and then I'm going to click on the left square bracket. And again, you're going to see one of my favorite new features of ePrime. This is attrib sense. And it actually references that points earned. And if you look here to the right, it says attrib sense. Points earned is defined in a script editor. So it's actually pulling out all the c.setAttrib statements that I used in my inline script. So now when this runs, instead of saying great job you've received and then they'll see the word points earned, they're actually going to end up seeing the number of points that they earned for that trial. And then I'm going to take another text display object and put it at the bottom of the screen here. And I'm just going to shrink that just a little bit, and I will say press space to continue. And then this, I'm going to actually change the properties here. So go to the properties page, click on the duration input tab, and again, I'm going to change the duration of this one to infinite. I'm going to add a keyboard input mask. I'm going to change my allowable to space and set my data logging to timeout only here, because I don't necessarily need to know the response time or the RT value of the feedback object. I just need to know that it appeared and for how long it appeared. All right, so now that I have my reward state here, I'm going to go ahead and make a new slide state. So I have the option here to add slide state, but if I click on this drop down here, I have the option to clone the slide state. And what that's going to do is it's going to make a separate slide state with all of the objects on it identical to this one. And I'm going to do that because it's going to save me a little bit of time, and I'll show you why. So I'm going to click clone slide state. And once it's done cloning the slide state, it'll say reward state 2. Now I know from my process responses inline object that I don't need this to say reward state 2. I know that this one needs to be called explode state. So let's go back into this feedback object, make sure that reward state 2 is highlighted because you'll see it in light blue there. And I will call this one explode state. There we go, and you'll see that name change down there as well. Now let's go ahead and change some of these things. Change some of the properties on here. So first I want to change great job because they didn't do a great job, they popped the balloon. So I'll say too bad at the top. And I'm not going to include that points earned because they don't get any points if they explode the balloon. Now earlier I talked a little bit about how it was important that the balloon object in my balloon task was 50% of the screen, both height and width, and that it was in the very center of the screen. This is why it's important, because it's going to look a little jarring to participants if the image of the exploded balloon and the image of the balloon itself are in different places. It's going to kind of break the immersion that you're popping the balloon, and that's kind of the crux of this task, is that you really don't want to pop the balloon. It's supposed to be kind of a detrimental thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on an image this time and not a button, and I'm going to format it just like I had for my balloon task. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the subobject properties page. I'm going to change this frame here on the frame tab. I'm going to change my height and width to 50% again, and my X and Y position to center, and click apply and OK. Now I'm going to go ahead and just move this up on the screen a little bit just so it doesn't overlap with my balloon at all, and it doesn't look like it does. Just move that up a little more. Perfect. So now I need to reference the image here, and if you remember from our process responses, I'm actually setting the image name for this exploded balloon right here on line 92 where it says exploded balloon. So go back into feedback object, click on the subobject properties page, and just make a quick attribute reference to exploded balloon. I'll spell it right. There we go. And if you notice, we don't actually have to put .bmp at the end here, because in my inline object, I actually go ahead and tack on .bmp at the end there. So that work's already done for me. I don't necessarily need to do that again. So that's my feedback object. I want participants to see this for as long as they want, so I'll have to hop into my properties page icon here, click on that duration input tab, and make sure that that's all set. It totally is. So then I need one more part of this, and to do that, it's just going to add a text display object to my feedback. Add a text display object just after my feedback, and I'm going to rename this one to ISI. So that interstimulus interval. If you remember, part of my process responses, one of the last things I did was set an attribute called ISI duration, or ISI dur. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on that ISI object, and I'm just going to set the duration of this to ISI dur, and then close out that attribute reference, say my data logging here set to time audit only, click apply and OK, and then I should have my practice trials already done. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK here, and I'm going to save it quick. And I'm going to go ahead and run the task just to see how it looks. So I'm going to run in windowed mode here. For those of you who'd like more explanation on windowed mode, definitely check out some of my past live streams. We go pretty deep into this feature. So I'm going to go ahead and click test so it comes up. And I won't log any data. I don't necessarily need to. All right, so there's my welcome screen. Press space for practice trials. There's balloon 1. So I'll go ahead and click the right arrow key, and you see it start to inflate a little more. And, oh, I popped it. So it said too bad, and then the balloon popped. Press space to continue. So we went ahead and tested that condition. Looks like it worked well. Thank you very much for your participation. Great. And I do want to run it one more time, because if you notice, I do have one more condition to meet. So it looks like the balloon exploding works exactly the way I want it to. Let's just make sure that pushing that left button does in fact give me points. I'm also a little bitter that I popped the balloon already. So I'll go ahead and run that one more time. Space, and I'll pump the balloon a very safe 3 times, and then click left. It says, great job, you received 15 points. All right. And it looks like the points counter is actually working as expected. I pumped the balloon 3 times. 3 times 5 is 15. Math, I did it right. Perfect. All right, thank you very much for your participation. And then, if I want to, I can go ahead and hop into my data file here and see how things are logged. So if you look here, these are the responses that I made. I made right arrow, and I made a right arrow response 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And then on my 4th response was that left arrow. And then these are the reaction times here. So this one, and this one are the reaction times for my first 3 pumps. And then that was my reaction time for the 4th pump of that left arrow key. And then I do want to look at that variable that I had just set, that ISI duration. So I had that set to a random number between 500 and 5,000. And it looks like on this trial, E prime actually opted to pick 871 milliseconds. So that's how long that ISI was then when I ran into it. And that's why it looked like it was a little quick. So now that I have my prac trial list already made, all I need to do really is just make my critical procedure, and that's really, really easy. Now that I have all of this done, I need to do really 2 things, 3 things, and then that's all I need to do in order to make my critical trials. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to make a nice little slide object right here at the very beginning of this, and it's just going to be called endprac because I'm going to be ending my practice. So this slide is basically going to tell participants, hey, thank you very much for the practice or for completing the practice trials. Let's go ahead and move on to the critical trials. And this could be a text display object as well. I'm just making a slide object because I like working with them. So I'm going to add a text display object right here, make it pretty big. And then just a very quick message. So thank you very much for completing portion of the task. Now we will move on to the critical trial. Press space to begin. There we go. And go ahead and click on the properties page at the top left hand corner. Click on duration input, change that duration to infinite, and I'm going to add a keyboard input mask change my data logging to time audit only, and change my allowable again to space. And hit apply, and okay. At this point, we should all be experts at this. All right, so that's all I need to do in order to make my little end practice message. And then I need to go ahead and redo some of the variables again. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add another inline object here. And I'm just going to call this one reset points. Because not only is this going to reset my points and set that points counter that I had earlier, not only am I going to be doing that to set it back to 0, because I don't want the points to persist between my practice and my critical trials. That doesn't make any sense. But I also want to redo whatever was in my end number here, because I want the end number to be different between my practice and my critical trials. It doesn't make any sense to have the same end number between practice and critical trials. So let's go ahead and we will add some inline script here. So the first thing I'm going to add is just resetting that total points variable that I had. So, and that's why I kept it in that. That's why I kept it in the user script, so I can actually manipulate it at any point in the experiment, and those changes are going to persist. So I'll just do total points equals 0. Actually, click 0. There we go. And now all I want to do is I want to copy the script from my end number, but make a few changes. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and I'll keep even this dim statement here I can keep. I'm going to go ahead and click on this reset points. And then I'm going to set it here. So I'm going to define my random number again as a long. My random number is going to equal between 1 and 100 again. Now, here's where I need to actually make my edits. If you look on lines 7 and 9, it's actually referencing a specific list object called prac trial list. If I keep it like this, E prime is actually not going to edit anything about this trial list that I'm going to make, and it's actually just going to edit this prac trial list. So I want to go ahead and delete the word prac from in front of here. Now what this does is it basically makes an obligation for me. It says I am now editing something called trial list. I need to make sure that trial list exists, because if you look at my procedure or in my structure window here, it doesn't exist. So I want to actually make these. But aside from that, this is exactly what I want. So now I'm going to actually show you kind of a really quick and easy way to make the rest of my experiment, because I basically want it to look exactly like my prac trial list. So instead of making a new list object, setting all of the variables, or setting all the attributes again, and then the possibility of me making a typo, which is very real, I'm instead going to click on this prac trial list and click copy, and then go into my block proc here and click paste. Now it says, the object you're pasting contains child objects. Would you like to paste all the child objects in addition to the primary object? I'm going to click no and watch what happens. So first off, I get a new version of my list object that I just pasted. I got this prac trial list, and that looks perfect. But then if you look beneath here, it also pasted fixation, balloon, process responses, fixation, or feedback, and ISI. This is great, because what this means is now I don't have new instances of these objects. I have references to existing versions of these objects. So I don't need to go ahead and retype process responses because it already works. I don't need to retype balloon task or redo balloon task because it already works. I already know that my practice trial works and this trial proc already works. So the only thing I needed to do was just make a new instance of this prac trial list. And I'm actually just going to rename this, because if you look in here, and that's actually at the end of the procedure, so let's go ahead and make these at the beginning quickly. There we go. If you look at my reset points, I have that obligation that I told you about to make sure that I have a list object right after this called trial list. So I want to go ahead and rename this to trial list. There. So now I have practice tasks and I have critical tasks, and they're going to be a different number of balloon inflations until it works. Now, because of the structure of this, if I actually want to add more trials to this, to my trial list, so let's say I don't want one practice and only one critical. Let's say I want participants to run through 5 critical trials. What I could do is I could change the weight here from 1 to 5. Now, keep in mind what this is going to do then is, with my reset points here, it's going to maintain that exact same random number for all 5 trials, and that's not ideal, because basically, after about 1 trial of not working well, I'm going to pump the balloon and say, okay, well, it pops at 10. If they all start popping at 10, I'm going to catch on that they're popping at 10. So then there's no longer a risk involved. There's no longer, oh, when's it gonna pop? I know that it's 10 every time, and that kind of defeats the purpose of the task. So if I want to add more trials to this, what I would do is instead of changing that weight there, I would go up into my block list here, and I would change the weight here. So I will do that 5 times instead of changing it down there. And the reason I'm doing that is because it's actually going to say, okay, I'm running from block proc all the way down, or I'm running the entirety of this block proc 5 different times. So participants are going to end up seeing nprac 5 times. There's a very easy way to get around that if I want to, is I can take my prac block proc and actually just move my nprac to the very end there and delete it from my block proc. So that way, they only see that nprac once, because it's at the end of the practice technically, and E prime is going to run through this block proc 5 times, and it's going to run through everything in this block proc, which includes resetting the points. So it'll be different every time. So I'm going to go ahead and click compile just to make sure that it works. I'm going to click save, and we'll just run through it really quick to make sure that it works exactly the way I want it to. All right, so go ahead and click test. And we'll change the subject number. This will be 2. Click space, and then, all right, so we know that this works. We know this is the practice. And let's see how many pumps it takes to pop this one. The only downside is 100 pumps is surprisingly long. All right, so I popped it. So now it says, thank you very much for completing the practice portion. Move on to the critical trials. So these are now all going to be different. So there should be 5 of them. And I'll go ahead and play it safe there. Got 110 points. There's my ISI. Like I said, it's going to be a random number between 500 and 5,000, so 5,000 might take a few seconds. And then I'll go ahead and pump this balloon a few times, and then 165 points. Looks like I'm getting better at this. And then the benefit of this is once we actually run the data file, or once we actually look at the data file, we can see how many they were supposed to have, because I have that. I just popped it. They have that end, or I have that end number there. There's my ISI, and that one was like 2. That was crazy. I'll stop that one at 2. There we go. Thank you very much for your participation. Let's go ahead and take a look at that data file real quick just to see what I missed, or not what I missed, but to see how many pumps I could have had. So in this case, I'm looking specifically at end number. And one way to, so there's increment. So it looks like it was getting 5 was the first one, 3 was the second one. That's how far I got. Now, there are easy ways and there are hard ways to, oh, I was right, that one was 2. So easy ways and hard ways to look at the data file. I'm doing it the hard way. And the hard way is, let's scroll all the way to the right and left and take a look at these column headings. What I could do instead is click on this arrange columns, remove all, and only pick the ones that I want. So I'm specifically looking for a column number called end number. So I would type end number, and I would hit enter, and then I would add that one and click OK. So now I only see the end number, so how many pumps I could have had. So the first one was 71, so that was quite a lot. Then it seems like it stuck around the 30s, and then I got it right. It was 2 on that one. And then the last one was 69. So it looks like it was, doing a good job of randomizing between pretty long trials like that 71 and really, really short trials like that 2. So it does do a good job of kind of adding that risk factor in there. So all I need to do if I want to see all my other columns is click on Restore Spreadsheet, and I have all my data back, because in eDataAid we don't actually delete columns, and if we do, it actually really, really tries to not let you delete columns. See, it says use the delete command on the edit menu to set a range of cells to null. So I mean, you can't even click delete on these things because we don't want you losing any data by accident. All right, so that is an entire BART, or a so it's the entire BART task. If you guys have absolutely any questions at all, please feel free to submit a support ticket. If you have ideas for future webinars, if there is a task that you would like to see, or if there's anything that you would like to see me kind of demonstrate the functionality of in one of these live streams, please feel free to leave a comment. If you have any questions about this, also leave a comment. Feel free to like and subscribe to the channel. Helps me, continue to do what I do. So I'm always happy if you guys do that. And if you would like to see a finished version of this task, keep in mind that you don't have to always follow along the entire webinar. We actually have this task hosted on our experiment library. So if you go to support.pstnet.com, sign in using the sign in feature in the upper right hand corner, and sign into to your account on our product service and support site, you'll see a little entry called experiment library, and we have this task, and this video should be embedded in the task as well. So it, kind of helpful. Not only do you see the task, but also exactly how we made that task. But if you have any other questions, feel free to submit a support ticket or anything like that. Otherwise, thank you guys very much and have a great day.